So, setting that nonsense aside for a moment, if you apply this theory of harmonic resonance to the Cavendish experiment, it actually makes a lot of sense. You see, the Cavendish experiment was intended to weigh the Earth in 1731. This is an era devoid of the understanding of electromagnetism, and they would have thought the center of our galaxy was stationary if they thought the sun was moving at all, of course. But Cavendish intended to weigh the Earth using the assumed diameter of the supposedly spherical Earth and estimated the force due to acceleration in terms of the spinning globe and so on. Cavendish was apparently a brilliant scientist, but part of me wonders whether he was a real single genius person or if work attributed to Cavendish was possibly the result of a combined effort conducted by multiple unnamed sources, while the credit, fame, and perceived genius goes to a person who is essentially a puppet or a patsy. The unnamed cohorts would certainly come in handy to independently verify Cavendish's findings. That certainly wouldn't hurt. This might sound a bit paranoid, but there are actually precedents for this sort of scam in other areas of history. For one example, Einstein was a patent clerk for many years and was described as a buffoon who couldn't even tie his shoes and was accused of stealing inventors' ideas during his years as a patent clerk. It would be very easy for the elite, rich, and powerful men of that era to prop up a complete buffoon and showcase them as a renowned genius in order to push an agenda such as relativity, in spite of mounds of evidence against it. I think it's highly possible that Einstein was nothing more than a sticky-fingered patent clerk who stole many of his best ideas from unwitting inventors applying for patents. Relativity hit the scene with all the hype of a modern blockbuster movie, and just in time to save the day for heliocentrism when it was coming under heavy fire by the scientific community as a response to contemporaneous experiments proving a stationary Earth and a diminishing speed of light. For yet another example of secret societies propping up a patsy to push an agenda without being in the limelight, look at the story of William Shakespeare.
But Sir Francis Bacon seems to lead the pack of would-be bards, with well over 200 books, essays, and pamphlets on the subject, many of which insist he is the real and true Shakespeare. Meanwhile, Baconian scholars argue that the Stratford man simply lacked the experience and education to have written the works that bear his name.
There is a mystery because when you look at the plays, everything that's in them and what lies behind them in terms of experience, knowledge, and so on like that's expressed through the plays, and the philosophy in the plays, and so on like that, they do not match up with what we know of the life of the actor. In fact, the life of the actor is quite well known. There's quite a lot of research been done on William Shakespeare Stratford, so a lot is known about his life, and none of it matches up what you can deduce from the author from the plays themselves. In fact, the more we find out about the life of the actor, the worse it gets.
Here you have a guy who is barely literate enough to make a mark, much less write his name. His mark was only existent in 5 documents. There's not a single letter either from him or to him by any of his contemporaries. How can this guy have written the greatest literary works in the history of the world? It just didn't happen.
Whoever's the author certainly knew about certain things happening abroad in the royal courts, in France, in Italy, and in Spain.
Not only taught the workings of the court, but the intrigues as well, and who would know that? Certainly not a play actor like the William Shakespeare. There's no way that man could have known the intrigues that went on inside the court. But Francis Bacon did. He was well familiar with it. He was brought up in the court.
You can't just say, oh, genius did it all. It's impossible for genius alone to do that. You've got to have all that background experience, knowledge, and so on, to get something like the Shakespeare plays.
There's even a quote from one of the justices, one of the English justices, that it's clear that from the Shakespeare writings that the author had to be an attorney because there is not a single legal error contained in any of them.
He writes, the author writes, naturally as if he's a lawyer. It doesn't just put in legal terms here and there just to suit the story. It just, legal terms and the whole legal jargon just rolls off him absolutely naturally as if he's used to living in that environment all the time. Well, that doesn't fit the actor from Stratford.
There's just no way the historic William Shakespeare could have written these plays.
There's only one person who could possibly be the author of those plays, which is Francis Bacon.
There's evidence that William Shakespeare couldn't even write his own name, and the literary works attributed to Shakespeare were actually the collective works of a secret literary society who wanted to push certain agendas, some of which appeared to be benign, but possibly more insidious ideas were in mind. At any rate, a secret society appears to have propped up the figure in the works of Shakespeare. For some reason, the real authors didn't want their names to be known throughout history, and they wanted their collective literary works to be credited to the single buffoon, William Shakespeare. The name Shakespeare itself is an allusion to the pagan goddess Athena, which would be typical of the secret society types we're all very familiar with in the Common Era. Although their agenda in terms of the Shakespeare hoax may have benign elements, such as enhancing the language and setting a standard for future literary works, there are always real social implications when a seemingly genius visionary single-handedly changes the paradigm or the perception of the masses, seemingly overnight, where a group of rich elitists would fail in such an endeavor should they attempt to manipulate the social climate with their true identities known and using their typical manipulative tactics. For example, if Rothschild and Rockefeller wrote a book or directed a movie, people would be very wary and probably would never go watch the movie or read the book. Well, some people still would, of course, but if they paid a patsy to take credit for making the same movie, then the masses would flock to it like they always do, and would subscribe to any ideas suggested to them by the plot, subplot, or subliminal messages inserted into the work. I believe it was Freemason Francis Bacon who was responsible for most of the writings attributed to Shakespeare, although it appears there was an entire literary society involved with creating the works of Shakespeare and transforming a total buffoon into a straw man or ventriloquist dummy persona of a literary genius who drastically changed the culture and fundamentally touched the hearts and minds of the masses who would have otherwise been impossible to reach using some other method. Getting back on topic, most of Cavendish's work was left unpublished and unheard of until after he was deceased. I think it's possible that Cavendish was a front man, a puppet for a group of elitists with an agenda. Again, I know I'm sounding awful paranoid and conspiratorial, and yes, I'm wearing my tinfoil hat, but seriously, it's a possibility. Even if Cavendish was a regular single person, his experiments and alleged findings totally changed the world of physics to this day, and we still use the numbers he came up with, known as the gravitational constant, or Big G in physics. Since the 1700s, we still use that same number to weigh the sun and weigh the earth and so on. All these extrapolations are based on the assumption that Cavendish was correct in his initial assumption going into the experiment. Even if the numbers are correct, the fact that the world is demonstrably not a spinning globe renders the presupposition, and therefore the conclusions reached by Cavendish, as totally fallacious. And now we must look at other explanations for the data documented during the Cavendish experiments. So I submit it's possible that the scientific work attributed to Cavendish may have been the culmination of a secret society with an agenda to control the field of physics from that point forward, specifically by supposedly proving the gravitational constant and thereby weighing the Earth. The observations documented by Cavendish may be accurate. For the sake of argument, I'll give the observations and data the benefit of the doubt and assume the numbers are accurate. In terms of the conclusion of the experiment, I have major problems, which I'll explain. First and foremost, since we know the Earth isn't spinning and it's not a globe, then Cavendish was way off base in the fundamental premise or presupposition of his hypothesis, or presupposition of his experiment. Since the two lead balls are of similar density, according to my theory, they would be attracted to one another simply because they are resonating at a similar frequency at a molecular level. The two objects are close enough together that their similar vibrational state will attract one another. This attraction has nothing to do with gravity as we know it, as a warping of space-time, but instead it has to do with this natural balance, a different type of attraction. Almost a magnetic attraction, but instead of an electromagnetic attraction, sort of a density magnetic attraction. And okay, I realize that sounds a bit silly, and it's probably not the best way to phrase it, but the point still stands. If you study a bit into the grand unified theory, it's theoretically possible that all the natural forces of the universe are all just different aspects of the same single force. For example, electricity and magnetism were always considered totally separate, unrelated phenomenon until the connection was made that electricity and magnetism are simply different aspects of the same force. We must explain the observations and data documented during the Cavendish experiments, and it appears there is an attraction going on here that is not explained by magnetism, nor is it explained by gravity as we know it. So, if there is some type of harmonic resonance at play here, how could we detect that? How could we measure it? We may or may not have the technology available to measure such an attraction, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Scientists have been searching for gravity waves for many decades, however, they've never found anything because, well, gravity doesn't exist. But I submit that if our scientific community focuses on finding a relationship between separate bodies of similar densities and the attraction between the two being related to something other than gravity, we could make some major scientific advances almost overnight. One thing to mention is that in the original Cavendish experiments, there was airflow going on there, and so the fact that the two balls were attracted to one another could have been caused by something as simple as airflow, or the different densities in the air affecting the two different balls. So it doesn't even necessarily have to be this harmonic resonance that's, according to my theory, it could be something completely different, something simple. I believe the ancient builders, for example, the builders of the pyramids in Giza, were well aware of the principle I'm describing here. There's no possible way, even with today's technology, to accurately move solid granite or limestone blocks the way that the Egyptian builders apparently did. Hundreds of feet into the air with such a precision that you can't fit a human hair between the two laid blocks. I believe the reason we can't replicate their techniques is because they knew something we don't. They knew there wasn't this force of gravity as a constant tugging down towards the ground, but instead there was a harmonic resonance between objects of similar densities, and by phasing out or negating such a resonance attuned to the high-density object like granite, and somehow altering the wave patterns to match that of a much less dense substance, say that of the air, it would be easy to maneuver and perfectly place giant, massive blocks as if they were weightless. So if this theory is true, the ancient builders didn't overcome gravity, since gravity doesn't exist, but what they overcame was possibly the harmonic resonance of high-density objects. To me, it makes perfect sense that since we live in an electromagnetic universe as well as a musical or tonal universe, unrelated bodies can be attracted to one another by forces we're already aware of, we just haven't put the pieces together yet. A big reason for this is the fact that most of our brightest scientists have been off looking for the proverbial dragon shit known as gravity or dark matter up in the sky, and we really need help figuring this sort of thing out in reality here on the ground, on the physical plane. Our bright-minded, skeptical scientists should not be off figuring out how much galaxy clusters weigh, which is utter nonsense with a capital N. Our scientific community should stop wasting their time and our money trying to prove gravity and dark matter.